Welcome, Dr. Pear. Are you there?
Yes, here I am. Thank you very much. Thank you for
Hello,
having me.
welcome. How are you today?
Doing okay. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. So
Should
we
I
will,
try to share my screen to see that it works for the
oh,
presentation, or should I wait for that?
you can try it right now. It's okay.
Okay.
So that we can start on time at 6 p.m.
Okay, great. Does that work well there?
Sorry?
You can see my screen well.
No, I cannot see it right now.
Oh,
Ah,
no?
now something is happening. Ah, right. Now I can see it very well. Perfect.
Okay, great.
Perfect. So where are you currently?
I'm in Jerusalem here.
Oh, nice. How is the weather?
My husband just told my son, he said, Mom has to go speak in Vienna. He's like, you're going now? I said, no, on Zoom. The weather was beautiful today, very sunny. How about in Austria? How is it?
Oh, it's so cold. I think we have only 1 degree, or I don't think not even that. And we have also a
Wow.
little bit of snow. So you are
Wow.
much luckier than we are.
Well, that's good. It gives me hope that it's not all global warming and
No, not
and
in Vienna.
not in Vienna. I got to have Professor Ednan Aslan here in our home. So
Mhm.
when he was visiting Jerusalem,
Yeah,
but hopefully I'll get to visit you all in Vienna one of these days.
hopefully. You're always welcome here.
Thank you. And Tamara, what is your specialty of research?
I'm a pre-doc and I work with Professor Aslan in Islamic religious education also.
Exciting. Do you have a particular focus, what you'll write on for your PhD or?
We have a project about the yield of Islamic religious education in Austria, and that is what we're working now on. So, okay. But can you see me? Because I cannot see myself here.
So should I stop my share for now and I'll start it again after you finish speaking?
No, I think that's okay. But can you see me right now? Because I cannot see myself here.
Okay, I see you like
Okay.
as one of the participants.
Okay, then it works. Then it's okay.
Okay.
So it's exactly 6 p.m. now, which means that we can start slowly. Hello and good evening from Vienna, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tamara Nili Freudenschuss, and on behalf of the Department for Islamic Theological Studies of the University of Vienna, I would like to welcome you to another interesting speech as part of the lecture series, Religions and Science in Current Discourse, Areas of Tension, Challenges, and Opportunities. This lecture series was organized by the Department of Islamic Religious Education and especially by my dear colleague, Dr. Şenol Yadil, whom I would like to thank warmly for making this possible. So thanks, dear Şenol. And first and foremost, of course, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our speaker today, Dr. Rachel Per, who has agreed to give a talk today on religious and scientific instruction on evolution and origins in Israeli schools. So welcome, dear Dr. Per. Before I introduce Dr. Per and her topic today in more detail, I would like to make a few remarks about the proceedings. The speech will take about, I think, 40 minutes. And after that, dear listeners, you will have the opportunity to ask your questions to Dr. Per. For this, I would ask you to raise your hand in Zoom, or of course, it is also possible that you write your questions in the chat. And now, to not wasting any more time, I would like to introduce our speaker in more detail. Rachel Per is a research fellow at the University of Haifa, where she coordinates the project Dialogue in Science and Religious Education. And she's also a postdoctoral fellow at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, where she's working on the replications in the humanities sub-project of the epistemic progress in the Humanities Project. She co-founded a researchers network for those who study the interactions of science and religion in society in the Middle East and North Africa, and co-teaches continuing education courses for teachers on evolution and Judaism. Dr. Per lives in Jerusalem with her husband and their 5 children. Dr. Per will now hold her lecture on religious and scientific instruction on evolution and origins in Israeli schools, where she will present to us, among other information, preliminary results of her interesting project at the University of Haifa, Dialogue in Science and Religious Education. Dear Dr. Per, I hereby turn the floor over to you, and we are looking forward to your speech.
Tamara, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and really thank you to everyone at the University of Vienna, the Institute for Islamic Theological Studies, for the invitation, especially my dear friend and colleague, Professor Ednan Aslan. We're very honored that he is an academic advisor to our project at the University of Haifa. And I am so pleased that here where I'm sitting in Jerusalem in my home, we even got to have Professor Aslan over for a very, very memorable evening for dinner. And it's really a joy and a thrill to be able to continue the collaborations. So as Tamara said, I'd really love to work towards the discussion part of the evening, where I get to hear what's on all of your minds and things that you're working on in the European context and wherever you are doing your research, because I'm sure there's much overlap and intersections. But I will start by beginning to talk a little bit about the project that we are doing here to share some data, things that have not really seen publication yet. We're still working on the end of the data collection, and then we'll be working on articles on these topics. So it's exciting to be able to share with you some of the information as it's in preparation. In particular, I'm going to share with you much of the data that I was able to collect in terms of in-depth interviews that we had here in Israel with Bible experts on the issue of should the interface of evolution and creation be presented in Bible class. So that will be a lot of the material, but we're going to first do a little bit of an introduction and an overview so that we can get there. And I also just want to say that even though the focus is on this particular topic of teaching about religious and scientific perspectives on origins, we do have the overall question in our study of, could this be a case study of something much larger? If we could figure out how we could talk about the subject, which is considered sensitive or loaded or not so simple for people to talk about because there seem to be differences of opinions. If we could work on talking about this complicated subject, could this perhaps also help us think about how we could talk about other sensitive and important subjects in our classrooms? So just as a very quick preliminary word of information, I think I also see that one of my colleagues from the project, Nijmi, has joined. I think I see you in the dark there. You're not so lit up, but I will just introduce her very briefly to say that Nijmi is writing her PhD specifically on the Muslim responses in our project. So as you see here, there's 4 very overall streams of education in Israel. One of them, our project does not relate to at all. We do not have any of our questionnaires or interviews with the ultra-Orthodox independent schools, but the project has interviewed and had questionnaires go out to the 3 other school systems of the state general secular Jewish schools, the state Jewish religious schools, and the state Arabic language schools. So Nijmi is doing all of the research in the Arabic language, and hopefully she can speak to us a little bit about any questions that come up on that. I will present a tiny bit of her data, but I'm very, very excited about her project, and she's doing amazing things. For example, translating the questionnaire that's been used around the world in English and in French called the MATE, the Measure of the Acceptance of the Theory of Evolution, and she coordinated the first translation into Arabic that we know of. So that's a very exciting part of our project as well. And I'm excited for her to hopefully chime in a bit. But I just wanted to share the context of evolution education in Israel, which is that for many years there were some complaints that certain parents or other members of society were worried that evolution was not being taught enough because it was such a sensitive subject. And so therefore there were curriculum changes that went into effect not too long ago. And in particular in 2015, the evolution unit, which had been an optional unit in the biology curriculum, in the biology major in high schools, switched to be part of the ecology unit, which is a mandatory unit. So at that time, this was somewhat of a large shift to take a subject which had been considered somewhat sensitive, that teachers oftentimes chose not to teach, then to have it become a mandatory part of the curriculum. And not only that, but the matriculation exam in biology also began to make sure to ask questions about evolution. So that seems to be one of the mechanisms that ensures that teachers do teach the material, because obviously they want their students to succeed on the exam. And one of the questions I asked back then with other colleagues before this other project began was, is there any way we can support teachers and students in this change? If there are students out there who feel like evolution is a subject which might be difficult for them, might even go against certain religious principles, how can we make this change in the curriculum without offering resources for teachers and for students in terms of how to understand this scientific theory also in their religious context? So at that time, I worked with a few other, first of all, let me just say, one of the things that made me, Nijmi, now you have the light on, so now I see you well. One of the things that made us also reinforce the impression that we had that this was such a sensitive subject, there was a Pew study that came out in Israel in 2016, just 1 year after this curriculum change went into effect. And you can see the numbers that make the issue look very stark and very polarized from a cultural and religious point of view. For example, here, the terms had originally been written in not in Hebrew, but in their Hebrew forms in English, and the blue box translates them just into English. If you see in terms of the percentage of Israeli Jews who say humans and other things have evolved over time, so again, the segment that our study does not relate to is the ultra-Orthodox segment, but still that's obviously a very low number of only 3% of the population that's self-defined as ultra-Orthodox, agreeing that humans and other things have evolved over time. Of the Jewish religious population, only 11% agreed. Of the traditional people who self-defined as Jewish traditional, only 35% agreed that humans and other things have evolved over time. And then there's a very large jump in terms of secular Jews who agreed with that statement. And the numbers were sort of similar for Muslims and Christians as well, because as you see, the percentage who say that humans and other things have evolved over time for Muslims and Christian here were about 38 and 37%, which is quite similar to how the numbers for traditional Jewish Israelis. So in general, it seemed that Israelis, be they Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, when asked about whether they accepted evolution, much less than half of them said that they could accept evolution, and this seemed to be related to somewhat of a cultural stigma that religion and evolution could not coexist and live peacefully side by side. So this made us feel that teachers in religious and traditional school systems that were teaching the subject would certainly need materials and resources to help them be able to teach this in their communities. So at that time, that's what I started to say earlier. Some of us did begin giving some seminars in these courses where we would present perspectives from the Jewish tradition from even up to 100 years ago and onward throughout the 20th century that actually were quite positive about evolution, despite this cultural stigma that we were seeing in 2016 of the low numbers of acceptance. If you mine the tradition backwards from the when Darwin first wrote On the Origin of the Species in 1859 onward, there's actually been research that shows a very large amount of positive traditional responses in Judaism to evolution. And we wanted to expose teachers to those sources so that they could be resources for them and their students to address the issue also from a philosophical and a religious perspective, in addition to from a scientific one. Again, I'm not going to go into it in depth now, but if anyone wants to ask about that in the question answer session part of this evening, I would be glad to answer any questions along those lines. And I just wanted to say that another study that I had done previously was on the historical reception of evolution. This was for my PhD. I actually researched American Jewish responses to evolution. And at that time, I had seen a development over the course of the 20th century, which matched a little bit of some of the few snapshots we've seen so far, which is that actually earlier in the 20th century, there were much more positive responses to evolution among traditional religious figures and rabbis. And it was around mid-century that there was a pushback that seemed to be against evolution. And I'll just say there were many, many factors that affected it, but certainly one of them was also scientists coming out with very anti-religious statements and using evolution to abuse religion, and then religious people oftentimes feeling that they had to fight back and saying, well, if evolution disproves religion, well, then I'm certainly not going to accept evolution. So there became a certain very strong tension and cultural tension between evolution and religion really around mid-century in the 20th century. And then after that, there were these two sets of sources. There were the positive sources towards evolution from earlier in the 20th century, and then the mid-century sources, which express some of this animosity. And people in the traditional and religious communities that I was studying was not necessarily sure what to do with these two very different groups of sources that they had in their own tradition. And what I noticed was this wasn't something that was different in Judaism. I actually noticed many parallels between what I saw historians had written about Christian responses to evolution, that there too, earlier in the 20th century, even voices who were anti-evolution were not necessarily young earth creationists. They accepted ancient earth and other things along those lines. And it was only in the 1960s that the strong young earth creationism that we recognize today took form and really spread, because earlier in the 20th century, that was a a very fringe position. So you see a transition over the 20th century, not just in the Jewish sources and the Christian sources, and I also found scholars who found similar things in Muslim sources as well. Here's Uriah Shavit, who is writing about certain trends in Muslim communities where he was researching, where there was a shift from, again, reluctantly reconciling the theory of evolution with the Quran in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and then later in the 20th century shifting to rejecting Darwinism. And our projects where we were trying to reintroduce some of these earlier sources and make them more familiar to the student population here was something, again, that we saw parallels in the work of Professor Rana Dajani and her work in Jordan, where she was facing somewhat of a similar situation. And oftentimes she would have students in her biology class who hadn't been exposed to evolution in high school because of it being a sensitive issue and not always being taught. But when she presented not only evolution, but perspectives that showed that there was not a conflict with the Quran, she found that there was actually a very quick turnaround in students' perspectives. And they were able to then, once they understood that evolution had more recently been linked with these issues of colonialism, imperialism, atheism, materialism, racism, but once she explained this as a historical process, which need not be the case, and in fact, we can understand evolution as not necessarily at all opposed to religion, and you could respect both religion and evolution, she was able to have these conversations easily with her students, and they were actually quite open to changing any preconceived cultural stigmas they had on the subject. So now I can start sharing a little bit of the material from the current, I hope that background was sufficient. Again, if not, please feel free to ask any questions, but now I'm going to start sharing some of the material from our current study. So this is going to be something that I'm not going to share that much on. This is what I had mentioned, the responses to the questionnaires, the MATE questionnaires, the measure of the acceptance of the theory of evolution. So one of the first things we wanted to know was, how did that Pew study in 2016 get it right? Is it really true that students are coming in with this anti or pro-evolution perspective based on their religious and cultural identities? And in fact, the preliminary results, we are still circulating the questionnaire, and there will be more responses in the final results, but certainly in the first 600 plus results, it does corroborate that general trend that the MATE had documented. Here you see the negative views of evolution, and here you see the positive views of evolution, and you certainly see the higher negative views of evolution among religious Jewish and Muslim students, and the lower negative views of evolution among secular, and vice versa, the same thing. The two other charts that I just thought to show, one here has to do with the question of the age of the earth. So this does not follow that same linear diagonal that we had seen on the other side of the charts. Here you have religious Jewish students having the most disagreement with an ancient earth, whereas Muslim students and secular students creating somewhat of a triangle here. And then the last chart, again, we can speak about all of these more in depth. I'm just showing very generally. And then the last chart that I wanted to bring your attention to was the non-contradictory score by school type. So what we see here is actually the population that assumes that there's the greatest contradiction between evolution and religion is actually the secular Jewish students. They had the lowest non-contradiction score. So it's secular students, which is something that has actually been documented around the world. At least I've seen studies in America, and I believe in England, that's shown in Christian contexts, that secular people often assume that religious people have more of an issue with evolution than religious people themselves believe that they do. So we have the lowest non-contradictory score, meaning secular students thinking that there's the most contradiction between evolution and religion, whereas religious Jewish students and Muslim students having an understanding of there being less of a conflict. So all of these results from the May questionnaire are interesting, but it's not necessarily clear, how do we put these together? How do we put together the understanding that religious Muslim and Jewish students feel that there's less of a contradiction, and yet at the same time, they still have a higher negative view of evolution and a lower positive view of evolution? So those are some of the questions that we are grappling with. And again, things that I'd like to come back to and discuss over the course of the presentation. What is also really interesting in these questionnaires is there's always space left for open answers, for students to write in freehand what they would like to add. So they don't only have to answer in a 1 to 5 scoring system, they can also add their own views. And I feel like this very much enriches the data. So here are just some examples that Nijmi had brought from Muslim students. We have, obviously, there's actually another woman, Netta Dagan, who's writing specifically on those who answered in Hebrew as opposed to Arabic. And then all of this has been translated into English for international presentation. So for example, these students wrote, Darwin's theory is scientifically incorrect because it divides man into categories and ranks, and that is racism. This theory is the reason for all the wars. So certainly, as Professor Dajani had mentioned earlier, if students are associating this scientific theory with racism and with war, then this is going to be something that they're obviously going to have a problem with. And any intervention that's going to try to talk about what evolution could and couldn't, does and doesn't mean is certainly going to have to relate to these understandings and associations of the students. Certainly, this is something that we also saw a lot. I can accept evolution, but not Darwin's theory. This differentiation that some students would make between Darwinism and evolution seems to come up again and again. And then this is more of a philosophical concept. There are things that are beyond human thinking abilities, meaning how far should science be going trying to ask these questions about the origins? And I think that these questions are really interesting to understand what's on students' minds. So it's not just saying they're rejecting evolution, but it's why, what are their thought process here? And I think that's important for educators to definitely be giving consideration to. And again, the data that I thought to speak about the most tonight related to the interviews that we had with the experts. Now, the interesting thing about the data from the experts is that it's completely different from the data from the students. And the missing category that we're not going to get to talk about tonight, because we don't have the analysis of that data yet, is the teachers. So we have 3 populations in the study. One is the students that we measured through the questionnaire. Now we have the experts that I'm going to speak about through the interviews and this Delphi survey. And then we have the teachers. And since there's such a difference between the students and the experts, we're very curious where the teachers are going to fall out in all of this. So basically, what we sat together as a group, everyone in the research team, Professor Hanan Alexander, who heads the project, and Tali Tal. Tali is a science educator, and Hanan is a philosopher of religious education, and all of us working on the projects sat down together and sort of tried to make up a matrix of where all the different people that we interviewed, how they would fall out on these questions of whether the topic of the interface of evolution and religion should be avoided in Bible class, should it be engaged in Bible class, both on the conceptual plane and on the pedagogical level, how it should be addressed. And one of the reasons why I say it's so different from what the mate might have suggested to us is you might have thought, if the students have this understanding that there's this contradiction between evolution and religion, that it would be the religious experts that say, let's avoid this subject. This is not a relevant subject. We should not bring up evolution at all in Bible class. And that's the exact opposite of what we found. We found the religious experts very much challenging the assumption that there is a conflict between evolution and religion. And the only experts that came down on the side of saying that this is a subject that should be avoided were actually the secular experts. So now I'm going to offer you some of the some of the data from the interviews so you can get more of a sense of how this really plays out in a full way. So this is an example of a secular Bible expert. And this expert was one of the ones who said that evolution should not come up in Bible class because it is completely not relevant to Bible class, because in the secular understanding, the Bible is not a religious work. The Bible is a cultural work. It's a historical work. It's many things. But if it's cultural and historical, then it really has no connections to the origins of life. It has connections to its historical time period, to other works of literature from that period, but certainly there were secular experts that said it is inappropriate to raise evolution. Whereas religious experts were very interested in raising the issue of evolution in Bible class, many of them. Again, I'll give you more data, a bit more data on that in the Delphi survey. But the assumption is that from these experts was that there is no conflict at all. Here's a quote from one of them. The approach of most of the traditional Bible commentators on chapter 1 of Genesis is that it's not describing the creation of the world. There's no realistic description, so there's no conflict with any theory. You could bring any physical theory and it could work because there's nothing here that is a competing theory. And they thought it was some of them thought it was very important to make sure that some of them assumed that students already understood that there shouldn't be any conflict with evolution, and others thought that it's important to explain that. So this is one of the places where we saw the gap between the students who assume that there's a conflict and the experts who understood that there is no conflict in their view, and maybe sometimes assumed that the students would know that as well. But the question of what to do about that gap between the expert views and the students' understandings is definitely one that we would like to think about more. Again, getting back to the idea of the non-contradictory score that we saw among the students, that is something that we saw paralleled in the experts. The only experts that really came out with the understanding that there is a conflict were not the religious experts. Again, it was secular experts projecting a conflict onto the religious population. So this is the secular expert who said the religious perspective did not accept Darwin and refuses to accept and integrate evolution until today, not only in Judaism. So this is a view that they have of the religious perspective necessarily being in conflict with evolution, which is fascinating because the religious respondents were not expressing that about themselves, but secular respondents were expressing it in terms of their understanding of the religious view. And this related a bit also to how the issue should be presented in the classroom if we move over to the pedagogical side. There was the issue of diversity raised by the experts, and only one expert cited diversity as a reason of why they thought perhaps not to raise the interface, because they themselves did not think there was a conflict, but they didn't know if it would be appropriate to teach that to all of the students, especially not in the curriculum as a mandatory part, because maybe some parents in some communities would be opposed to that. But there were a number of experts who raised the issue of diversity as a reason to engage in the subject, especially in the secular stream, because they felt that even in the secular stream, there are traditional students who are learning there, and it would be very relevant for them. But again, we found that there were these two groups within the secular experts, those experts who are really interested in presenting the issue in a very broad sense of saying, you know, there are many different religious perspectives on the issue, and there are also many different secular approaches to how people have understood this issue. And then there were those who really understood it in a very binary way, as we had discussed before, sort of pitting the religious view in opposition to the scientific view. So there were actually those experts who were concerned about this issue being raised in class if it was done the wrong way, because perhaps it could do more harm than good. And here's a quote from one of these concerned experts. When I have seen the topic addressed, it is often done unsuccessfully through pointing to the two possible approaches, the religious or the scientific secular, which only reinforces the dichotomy that students come with. So again, one of the questions of the study is trying to make recommendations of if the topic should be addressed, and then perhaps even more importantly is how it should be addressed, not to reinforce dichotomies, but to do the opposite, to unravel. And in terms of how important experts thought this was an issue right now, how live an issue it was for students, if they really felt this was something that was really of concern for them or bothering them. There was a split. There were people thinking, you know, this is not really what students get particularly worked up about today. And those who thought that this really still was an issue for students. The ones who thought it wasn't today said maybe it was 50 years ago, and today there are other issues in our postmodern age. And one of the thoughts that this raised in my mind is the fact that it's not the most heated issue of the day might make it actually easier to be one of the sensitive subjects that we try to address in the classroom, because perhaps the most hot button issue might be harder to bring in as a case study to analyze how sensitive and loaded topics could be addressed in the classroom. And so this might not be bad that evolution is not necessarily considered today the most sensitive issue. And it could actually be to the advantage of exploring how to discuss the topic more. The last few quotes I wanted to bring from the interviews were some self-reflection on some of the parts of the interviewees. And I believe that they speak to both the local cultural context that we were facing here in Israel, but I also think that they relate to some much more broader global themes. And I would be curious to hear how they resonate in the contexts where all of you are living and researching. So one of the secular experts pointed to this issue of secular arrogance that he feels could be an issue in the secular school system, especially as we said, there are traditional students sitting in that school system. And secular arrogance could set up an equation that religious belief is primitive and secular science is progressive, and the position itself is ignorant to hold and propagate. It's a dichotomous position that negates thousands of years of belief as infantile. But they did think that this was a live issue that students could possibly feel in the education system, and it was one to pay attention to, especially teachers when they addressed this issue, that he thought that was something that could even be looked at in a reflexive way. One of the religious experts talked about religious fear and how this is something that sometimes motivates the religious system to try to not talk about anything that could possibly lead students away from a religious way of life, that there's this sort of demographic threat that many religious students who are raised in religious households then abandon those traditions and become secular later on in life. And this prevents a fear, perpetuates a fear. But on the other hand, this expert mentioned a concern that they thought was actually valid in terms of how the science educators are presenting the issue of evolution. Are they trying to teach evolution in a way that when students come back to their, let me just move part of this Zoom so I could see, that students can return to their community religious, but also know about evolution? Or are they trying to teach evolution as a theory that if they understand it to the end, they will see that the religious project is nonsense? So on the one hand, this expert was pointing to that sometimes the fear is not justified, that it could be really overly cautious, but they were also pointing to an understanding of where it sometimes comes from, again, perhaps relating to that secular, arrogant position that the other expert was worrying sometimes infiltrates science education. And then the third issue I wanted to point to here is something that was brought up earlier, again, about racism. And the question is, how can we relate to these issues of the misuse of science in the past, particularly the misuse of the scientific theories that we're talking about? This expert said another form of damage done by evolution relates to social Darwinism, which brought terrible damage to the world and is part of the causes that led to the Holocaust. So again, it's the same issues that the students were pointing to. Experts also spoke to these issues. So I think it's very important when science educators and others are trying to craft the interventions that they speak specifically to the issues that are brought up in the field. So I think I have another 5 to 10 minutes left. So I do have some data from the Delphi survey that I was also going to present. It basically reinforces the themes that we've spoken about so far. But it might be interesting just to see how another tool and another format gave similar results to the interviews which we've looked at so far. So our Delphi survey in the first round basically asked 3 broad questions. And we did this Delphi survey, as I had mentioned, that the MATE questionnaire was also given in multiple languages to multiple populations. And the interviews, for example, I was bringing you the data of the interviews from the religious and secular Bible experts, whereas Nijme interviewed the experts in Islamic education, and researchers from the Technion interviewed experts in biology education. So here too, in the Delphi survey, this was administered separately 4 separate times to biology experts, to Islamic education experts, and then to the 2 streams of the Bible experts, the religious and the secular. And here I'm going to present to you the data of the combined religious and secular Jewish Bible experts. And again, if we want to reference Islamic education experts, we have Nijmi here and we can ask her, and the biology experts. I have some of that data accessible as well. And we're going to do a comparison between all the different groups in the articles that we're coming up with. So the first question is, should the possible relationships between religion and science be discussed in Bible class? Again, now you would already know perhaps from the interview that the only one who would say no is the secular. There was one secular expert who said absolutely not, whereas all of the religious experts and most of the secular experts said that this is an appropriate topic because this is something of interest to the students, and it is something that can and should definitely be addressed in Bible class. One of the questions sometimes with this question of evolution and religion is an issue of NIMBY, not in my backyard. Everyone thinks someone else is going to address it. Oh, it'll come up in biology. Oh, it'll come up in philosophy. Oh, it'll come up in homeroom. So we wanted to put the spotlight on the Bible class with the Bible experts. And when push came to shove, most of them did think that this should be addressed here. So in the first question, it was asked about science and religion in general. And in the second question, it went specifically to evolution. Should evolution be addressed in Bible class? And here again, the only hard no's were from secular experts asking what is the connection, whereas the religious experts, most of them said yes. Here's an example of a quote: almost every subject in Judaism relates to this subject. And then there were some who thought, again, as we had mentioned earlier, this is not the most important subject, does not need to be addressed and spend so much time on it, but it certainly can be mentioned briefly. And then there was a third question in the first round of the Delphi study of what we had mentioned before, how should it be addressed? So here it was sort of interesting. There were the largest majority, both in the secular and the religious experts, who said, explain the disciplines, nature of science, difference between science and religion, and put out a spectrum of views. But there were also, that's the first column here, explain the disciplines and the approaches, present different perspectives. There were experts, again, that's something that we've hinted at until now, who didn't say, present it as a total spectrum of all the different views. There were religious experts specifically who wanted a focus on the compatibility between science and religion. And one of them here, this is a quote, you could say, both science and religion are both loyal witnesses to creation. And they did not necessarily think that you had to present a possible conflict between them of all the different views. Focus on how there is no conflict. Where again, we had mentioned earlier, there actually were secular experts who said, present it as a conflict, the religious view versus the secular view. So it was very interesting how in the majority of cases, the religious and the secular experts agreed, but in the minority view, there was actually differences in opposite directions. And the second round of the Delphi study, of the Delphi survey, basically took quotes from the experts and then had the other experts rank whether they agreed or disagreed with those quotes. So it's a way of really confirming what you learned in the first round. So once again, we saw that religious Bible experts agreed that the interface should be addressed. So here's the first example. You should only discuss evolution in Bible class if students ask. You could see everyone disagreed with this. 1 and 2 are the disagree and strongly disagree. Don't only wait for the students to ask, bring it up. That was basically the religious experts' point of view. But the question of should this be presented as different models, people address this subject differently, there wasn't as much consensus on this. Some people, as we had mentioned, thought there should be certain models that are emphasized. And so while there is consensus on the fact that the interface should be addressed, the question of how it should be addressed, there is not yet consensus among the experts. 2 quick examples from the secular experts. They did not, as we had said, exhibit the same consensus that the interface should be addressed at all. So here the quote was, it's appropriate to address religious perspectives on evolution in Bible class. As you can see, there's no consensus on this issue. And the last example here, the interface between evolution and religion should be presented as oppositional. There were those who agreed very strongly with that, and there were those who disagreed with the subject. So to us, some of these findings were somewhat surprising that basically, first of all, there were only secular Bible experts who expressed opposition to engaging with the interface of evolution and religion in Bible class, even though there was definitely a split and there were secular Bible experts who thought it was important to engage with the interface. The consensus of religious Bible experts to address the subject was also somewhat of a surprise to us. And then the issue of the spectrum of views of how to relate to the subject. It was interesting to see that most of the religious Bible experts and some of the secular Bible experts challenged the assumption of conflict, as opposed to, as we had said earlier, the students, and we want to understand the gap there and how the teachers fit in. Just going over through the rest of the summary, we had mentioned how some of the secular Bible experts were concerned about bringing up the subject in the wrong way and reinforcing dichotomies that students come in with of the scientific view versus the religious view. And we also spoke a bit about the cultural context of arrogance, fear, historical misuse of science. And again, I'm curious how that resonates in your context. And I just wanted to share that right now we have a professional development course that's running for teachers based on the material that we've worked on so far in the project. It's a learning course, so it's being given now for the first time, and it's going to stay in development. Basically, it's an online environment that one of the researchers in the project developed for teachers with all sorts of materials on the subject that they can tailor to their classes and then offer it to their students. So it's the kind of thing where all the interaction and feedback will be stored within the system and can be researched so we can understand how teachers and students are using these materials. We also have recently just had a meeting with the supervisors of all of these subjects. It was really interesting sitting together on Zoom with the head of Islamic education, Bible education, both heads of Bible for the secular and religious Jewish streams, and for biology education, and having this conversation together. It was special, even if we weren't all in the same face-to-face, we were still on Zoom, but it was really wonderful to hear the different perspectives. I had outlined a few different questions that I also thought might be interesting for us to discuss. I was curious about our religious and cultural identities reinforcing perspectives that are overly critical of science. This is something that perhaps we see around the world. And then I guess the next question is, what do we want to do about that as people involved in education? Are there education interventions that could nurture students' abilities to engage with evolution in a deeper fashion and perhaps disrupt cultural stigmatization against the notion that evolution and religion could work together? And through these processes, could we perhaps encourage more respect for both science and religion? And I did want to leave my email address. Hopefully we'll have a chance to talk, but if people also wanted to send me anything by email, I'd love to stay in touch that way as well. And as my parting farewell, I did also just want to mention, I know Tamara said how we currently just recently began a researchers network for people who study science and religion, interface in society across the Middle East and North Africa. And we do have a call for papers right now. We are looking for emerging scholars and anyone who's been looking at these subjects. And we'd be really thrilled to have more people submit papers and get involved in the network. So if you happen to know anyone who's researching things in those subjects, I'd be really delighted to get to know them. And I will stop my screen share at this time. Let's see. And I think there's a question in the chat. Does that mean I should read it out here, or?
No, I will do it.
Oh, okay, great.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pell, for the interesting speech and the insight in your study. I think there will be many questions. And wonderful. When there is a question in the chat, we can start right with this. 1 second. Okay. Education is an agent for political socialization and culture. So if there is two main educational systems, religion and secular, do we get in the end graduates with two contradictory or conflicting political and worldviews?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fascinating question, and a question I think that worldwide people are struggling with in terms of how is it that we pass on to the next generation. Let's say, for example, if people are religious and they cherish religious practices, how is it that they can initiate their children into those practices? And not silo them off from the rest of society. The question is, just because a child is going to a religious institution, does that mean that then they are developing this alternate path of socialization and alternate worldview, which then differentiates them from other people in society? I could give you an example. I grew up in the American context, and we were just talking about it around our table. We have a friend who opened a Jewish school, and one of the questions was, well, shouldn't American Jewish children go to the public school system and not separate out to learn religious education? And this person had said, well, he had three heroes in his life. One was Martin Luther King, one was John F. Kennedy, and the other was a Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was also marched with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement and was very much a leader in those causes. And he said those three individuals are very much known for their universalism, but what they all have in common is they went to a parochial school to start their education. So for him, those were examples of people who go deep into their particular cultural worldview, be it in Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or any other religious perspective, but in a way that does not create a isolated community that does not aim to then integrate into the rest of society, but rather does the opposite. This going deep into your roots makes you more interested in connecting with others. But I definitely agree with you that it's certainly a challenge and a question. I mean, I don't know, I don't want to bring it up, but Nijmi, even in your own life, I think you experienced things along these lines of different members of your family going to different schools and choosing very different life paths. And, you can't always trace it back to particularly only that decision, but certainly if you want to pass on language, culture, tradition, sometimes you want to do that in a parochial way on the one hand, while on the other hand, still very much connecting to the rest of society. So I would love to hear what other people have to say about that, how they've experienced it. But I agree that it's very much a question.
Thank you very much. Are there more questions?
I have one question.
Yeah, yes, please, Herr Professor.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this interesting lecture. It was really very interesting. And best regards to Jerusalem.
We miss you.
Thank you, Rachel. You have different types of school in Israel. In which schools did your research take place? It is important. I would be interested to know how the students deal with these differences, Did you talk to the students about it? How do students deal with these differences in science, religion? They have differently teachers. Do you have some answer from your research about for this question? How the students in the schools, different types of schools, deal with these differences? Science, religion, and same question to you, Najma, same in Islamic schools, in Israel. How is the situation in Islamic schools? Perhaps some teachers tell different stories about science and religion in different subjects. They have more problem in this debate. Mm-hmm.
Thank
you so much. Yes.
Thank you, Adnan, for that question. So I will say that it is considered a more sensitive subject in the religious school system. Certainly, usually when you have an anonymous questionnaires in the secular stream, we were allowed to just distribute them without, for example, getting parents to sign consent forms. But in the religious system, because it was considered so sensitive, they also wanted to make sure parents were aware and agreed to the study. Certain schools did not even want the students to necessarily participate in the study. So it was definitely a question in that regard. And I will say that it sometimes, again, it's something that I tried to allude to a little bit when I was speaking, but I think that it's an identity issue in both directions. I've told this story of secular boy who I met who we once asked him if he wanted to join us for a certain religious ritual, and he said, "Oh, I don't believe in that. I believe in the Big Bang and evolution," and meaning that the science for them takes on also a cultural identity, again, which is sometimes seen as oppositional. So the question for me is, again, how can we sort of bring these different populations to be able to not necessarily see themselves in conflict from the get-go, and to perhaps see them as being able to have these conversations in a more open fashion. I understand on all sides how evolution and religion has sometimes been certainly used, has been weaponized at certain times to different communities. The term of identity creationism was coined with regard to Native American peoples when they felt that science was coming and saying to them, everything that you've learned in your culture and tradition about where you come from and who you are, you know, that's a lie. We'll come and tell you the true story. So I think that it's very complicated. On the one hand, it was difficult sometimes when the schools did not want to even allow the conversation. But on the other hand, I understood it. There was a religious school who said, the only way I want you to come and present the questionnaire to the students is then if you also do something with it. You don't just leave them with it as a question, but you present a class showing them the sources and speaking with them so that they also have some answers in addition to just questions on the subject. So I think there was a variety of responses. And as I said, we're still in the process, but Nejmi, I would love you to also chime in and share anything that you.
Thank you, Rachel, for your great lecture. And thank you, Adnan, for your question. I'm glad to be here with you. And I'll add that in Muslim schools here, your question, the answer is harder to give. It's harder because we teach we teach religion as a way of life. It's our story. The story of the creation is how I can say it, the most important story we learn at school. So it's very hard to come and teach evolution and not to say that it's not contradiction to the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
We have to work harder. We have to to deal with interpretations, with ta'wil, as we spoke about it earlier. So the story is more complicated here. That's what I can say for now.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We had a raised hand from Aysun Yasha.
Oh yeah, thank you very much for the inspiring presentation. And I just wondering if within the religious sphere, Orthodox, liberal, I don't know if there are different opinions towards evolution as well, because I myself am just busy actually with a project about the 19th century Judaism in Europe, and there were a lot of struggles within the different Jewish groups. And concerning this is one point, and the other point is a just comment, as I have analyzed the atmosphere in Turkey concerning the evolution theory. Not earlier than 2011, there was a reform of the actual government, and there they just take out the Darwinism and evolution theory from the curricula. So I think it's a political Islamic decision as well. And so we have to see the different Islamic concepts and accesses to the issue of evolution as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for both of those really good questions. So yeah, certainly, you know, there's always disagreements in Judaism, and there are certainly many different opinions. And as you said, I was raised more in the Orthodox liberal tradition. And in terms of the academic research on the subject, there have been many, many figures who were studied. So when we wanted to give the introductory seminar to students, we had to pick particular you know, recognizable figures to them. And basically our decision was we picked 3 different figures. 2 of them were very positive about evolution. I had briefly had their pictures up there on the screen. One of them was the first chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine, Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook, who passed away in 1935. And he wrote really amazing things about evolution on the one hand. On the other hand, you could say that it was a different theory of evolution then, because it was before the Darwinian synthesis that happened later in the 20th century. So there are many different questions we could ask there, but he certainly wrote really, really positive things about how, in his view, the scientific theory very much synchronized with his religious and philosophical worldview about a very dynamic world, not a static world, about a world that was moving towards something, in his view, again, which may or may not fit with how we understand evolution exactly, because for him it was very much related to sort of a progressive movement. So we brought his views because he's very well known in the communities here in Israel. And we also brought a view that I was well known in the communities in the United States where I was raised, of a Rabbi Soloveitchik, who originally also, both of them came from the Eastern European context. One of the hard decisions was we actually also presented an anti-evolution view. So we would not strictly present pro-evolution views to the students. We presented a very well-known Rabbi Schneerson, who headed the Lubavitch movement, which is not a liberal orthodoxy. It's a traditional Hasidic movement, and he wrote very anti-evolution perspectives in the 20th century. And so we shared those as well, so that students would not think that we were coming in with just an agenda of brainwashing them and trying to show them that everyone in the tradition thought that evolution was great and good, because they knew there were rabbis out there who were saying negative things about evolution. So to give them the chance to look at and analyze these perspectives, both 2 positive perspectives from sort of very different, somewhat theological perspectives to a certain degree, but also one that opposed evolution. And part of his opposition to evolution that he wrote about was also a certain literalism. Rabbi Schneerson wrote about how even if you accept all different other levels of interpretation and understanding, there should also be truth to the literal text of Genesis. And again, for me, in the traditions that I brought up with, that was difficult to relate to, because I've always understood religious interpretations and many different levels that could go well beyond the literal meaning of Genesis. But that was certainly the view he was putting forward. And I think this turn towards a certain amount of literalism is something, again, that we've seen across religious traditions, not just something that emerged or that was strengthened within Judaism in the 20th century, but I believe you could bring examples also from Christianity and Islam and other places. And to me, looking at that is interesting. So again, certainly to your first question, there are many very, very different views that have been researched academically. And one of our questions is, which ones and how should we bring them to the students? And your second question of the politicalization is no question. I mean, all of these decisions and in what should be in the curriculum and out of the curriculum, and what does it represent and what doesn't it represent. We've had cases here in Israel too of figures having to answer what their particular positions are on these questions, and it's hard to separate politics out from all of these things, but it's important to have the perspective and the conversations, in my view. So thank you.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. Dr. Areti Demosthenos writes, thanks very much for this very interesting project presentation. My question is whether in multicultural societies like Israel, Cyprus, etc., could be better to have not different systems in the education system, but only one, and then be joined secular and somehow religious in order to have all students as acquired same knowledge?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that, but I also forgot to relate to the thing that you were saying, how you're doing research on Turkey. So that means that we would love to also include you in the research network. Sorry, getting back to, so hopefully we can be in touch about that. Yeah, I think this question relates somewhat to a certain degree of what we were talking about in the first question. I will say that biology is a unified subject between the secular and the religious and the Arabic language stream in Israel. Some subjects are not unified. The history curriculums are different. As we spoke about, the Bible curriculums are different. Biology is something that is stayed unified across every educational sphere. So on the one hand, even if we can't say that there is a realistic, attainable, or, I don't think that all the systems will come together. We can debate whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing that there are these separate systems. I definitely understand what you're saying, but in biology, one of the reasons this question is so sensitive of how should it be taught in biology is because it's very important to the leaders in this field to not have it split according to the sectors, and not have a religious biology curriculum and a secular biology curriculum, and to leave it unified. So even if the general education systems are not completely unified, there are subjects like biology that have remained unified. So perhaps that's comforting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do we have another question? I think that in the audience, there should be also some teachers for Islamic religious education. Maybe one of them could express how they deal with this.
Yeah, I'd be really curious if questions come up from your students, and if it's been hard or easy to answer them, or.
You can also write your question in the chat and I can read it.
I forgot to mention earlier that along with Professor Adnan Aslan, another one of the advisors to the project is Dennis Alexander, who I also got to hear in your series. And I really commend you on initiating this whole series. And I would love to continue to hear about any further thoughts that come out from teachers experimenting with these questions in their classrooms. And
oh, we have another question, I think.
Yes, I see it.
Education is not the problem. The real problem is this: is that the social media that promote extremism beyond the class and syllabus.
Yes, I would agree that oftentimes when the students are quoting sources, they're definitely quoting clips from YouTube or other things on social media that they have read and they have heard. But some of our experts have stated that that's even more so why the education system, the classroom, the school needs to step up and have the discussions in a much deeper fashion, where they see their peers as full humans and people that they can really talk to and share their views with, because on social media, that is not the environment and the context, and the educators feel that that's, then the students get used to a very superficial and shallow discussion, and that should promote educators even more so to provide a different kind of a context and a different kind of a conversation.
Thank you. Okay. Some students already come to class brainwashed with extremist ideas. Do you have solutions for that? Okay, that's another question. Let's start with this one.
Well, I think what I would say some of the experts were saying is when we feel that the students are coming with these extremist views, the temptation is to sort of throw the hands up and say, what can we do? But the educational challenge is to say, can we introduce them to a different culture of conversation and a different way of really seeing their peers and having a different way of expressing these ideas in the school system? Do you feel that that's a possibility? I don't know who is asking this question, if they feel that it's a lost cause, or it's possible to try to see how much more important now than ever the educational system is for trying to work on a different tenor. I'm sorry, I see a few other questions there. I think they're from somebody else, but that would be my solution, is not to give up and say that those brainwashed students is the end of the story, but to hopefully feel that the education system has something to do to engage those students in conversation and to bring them to a different place. I'm not saying it's an easy ask or an easy task, but I think that's one of our big challenges today.
I think also, Rachel, you have to mention that teachers also with opposition to evolution, that also have the impact on the students, not only the social media or from outside the school.
I think, yeah, well, you have a spectrum, you have a variety. You have sometimes where it's not only the social media, which is giving negative views of evolution. Sometimes it is also the teachers. And we've certainly encountered those teachers who say, look, you need to write this on the test, but just know that this is not what we believe. You know, and these are well-educated teachers, but who have still a religious issue with evolution, for example. And then you have teachers on the other hand. So you have a whole spectrum of teachers that will be confronting this, but I definitely agree that the social media is another piece of this puzzle that cannot be ignored.
Thank you. Another question in the chat: what can schools do with your results? Or to put it another way, what research gap does this fill? And I think that's also maybe a part of it. One should not react to the theory of evolution with theological reflexes. We have to deal with the scientific findings of biology. Many lack scientific skills. That is why they want to reject emotional.
Well, actually, sometimes when people respond with religious responses, it is actually almost easier to have the conversation, because one of the more challenging things is people who come to say that the science has been disproven, when, you know, sometimes they're just really sort of masking a religious opposition to evolution with a theoretic, you know, a supposedly scientific opposition. So I don't have a problem when people want to ask religious or philosophical questions about the science. I think that's an easier question to engage with than when people have gotten misinformation about the science itself. So I think it is important to ask philosophical and religious questions about the science, as long as we can also sort of agree on what is the consensus of the science. I think that's an important point. So thank you for bringing that up. In terms of what gap does this research fill? I think there are different parts of the research which fill different gaps. I think that, again, people were curious if this Pew study approach showing the high levels of opposition to evolution among religious students, if that was actually true. So I think when we showed these results to the education system and they saw that this is what their students sitting in the classroom are thinking, I think that that was important for them to see that. On the other hand, in terms of the expert views of the interviews of what we were discussing today, that is still a work in progress. That's trying to understand, should the issue be addressed, and if so, how? I think that we are going to try to work on some policy recommendations, but I think that the conversation needs to continue with the experts. We're not going to just now plow forward. As I said, the professional development class that just began is going to keep hopefully going into the future. And this is going to have to be a prolonged conversation, understanding further the students' perspectives, the teachers' perspective, the experts' perspectives. And it's a very much the beginning of the conversation, I would say, rather than the end.
Thank you. Do we have another question? So that would be the last chance to ask the question.
Well, Tamara, just because I see your face, you're the only one I see right now. Does what the material that we brought concerning what we've researched, is it similar at all to what's happening in Austria? Do you think it's very different in Vienna or in the situation where you are?
I am actually not a teacher at school. That's why I also wanted the audience to take part in this discussion. But I think it's maybe very similar. We have a lot of different views on that. And what I can say is that we know from Islamic religious education at schools that sensitive issues are often not addressed. So they are just ignored because it is so difficult to deal with it and to make all the different parties satisfied with the answers you give in the class.
Right. There's a fear factor. I mean, we had teachers talking about how now they're also worried the students might record them and upload what they have to say to social media, and they bring it back to parents, and then parents will complain to principals. And so, you know, it takes a lot of work to convince teachers not to take the safe route of saying, what do we need to do this to ourselves for? Why do we need to cause the headache of getting involved in this really, really difficult subject? You know, let's just avoid it and prevent possible problems. So teachers have to have a lot of courage and be really, really motivated to want to engage with this subject. I really agree with that. And I really respect the teachers, but, you know, so many of them are obviously doing this for their passion and their life's mission of really giving the students the best they possibly can. And many of them are willing to go ahead with it. So I admire them very much for that.
It's a different job to be a teacher, but yeah. The students, they have questions, and when they cannot address it in the religious education class, then they find other ways for answering this questions.
That's exactly also what we got experts saying that this is, they will ask their questions, they will get answers, and they'll get it from, you know, less reliable sources, and they will also not trust the schools if the schools are not dealing with the questions that are on their mind and things along those lines. And one of the teachers that we interviewed suggested, she flipped it around and she said, look, I'm not an expert on these issues. You guys are interested in this, go out and research it and present it to your classmates. She took the students who were in the biology major and she said, bring it into Bible class. Let's do a comparison. Let's see how there are similarities and differences between what we're learning in Genesis and what you're learning in biology. So that was another really interesting approach of how she did it, of really getting the students to be the leaders.
Ibrahim, you have a question or something to add?
Yes, thank you, Rachel, for your insightful talk. My first question is more general one. I mean, it is, does science have to agree with the religion? That's my first question. And the second one is, how does the rejection of the students affect them? I mean, if they reject it, how does it affect them? I mean, are there, in their free mind, I mean, building their mind, and also in their in science classes, I mean, does it affect it, or what do you think?
Well,
And
thank you.
I'm sorry, I have a ill kid.
Oh, no, I
Help me.
also, please, I thought you for sure heard my children in the background.
Sometimes it was also hard
We're
to,
all having the kids chime
concentrate
in.
on.
It's
Sorry for that.
the next generation. It's very good. Well, that's one of the questions, I guess, that we were, bringing up a little bit. Some people feel that the ideas of the different models of how science and religion could relate are a bit outdated, and some people feel that it really should be presented and show the students that sometimes, there are those people and those times where people see a conflict. There are those who see them as agreeing and complementary, as you said. There are those who see them as separate. There are all these different ways of viewing the interaction, and sort of just bringing up the subject that sometimes there are ways where they agree and disagree and work in different ways is just important to even just broach the issue. And that was definitely one of the questions is you're not necessarily trying to guide the student towards a particular answer, but you're just trying to give them more tools and more abilities and more understanding of how different people have faced the question. I could give an example from actually a chapter that Nijmi and I wrote with another colleague of ours here in Israel. There was a big question in a small natural history museum that we have here in Jerusalem, where, again, this was the population that was not part of our study, but the museum was working hard to attract students who hadn't been coming to the museum. So specifically, let's say ultra-Orthodox students, they wanted their teachers to bring them and see the Science Museum. And so in some of those negotiations, apparently those schools asked for them to cover the evolution exhibit. They just did not want their students exposed to it. So the director of this museum felt very strongly, and we interviewed him and spoke with him for a long time, that it was the right decision of the museum, that they agreed to cover the exhibit. They said, no problem, whatever will get you to come and learn anything about nature and the environment and science, whatever we can do to get you to feel comfortable and come is worth it. And they had no problem, covering that. Whereas other people were very upset about the decision. And then Nijmi also interviewed some of the tours are also given in Arabic sometimes to Arabic language schools. And they, on the one hand, the leaders in those schools did not ask for the evolution exhibit to be covered. But when they would give the tour, they would say, look, this is about evolution. We don't necessarily agree with it. So there are all different ways that different populations were sort of dealing with the issue. Some people saying, we don't want to hear about it. Some people saying, let's learn about it and let's disagree, or let's see, some people agree, some people disagree. Some people saying we want to learn about specifically how the religion and the science can work together. So part of it is sociological, just seeing how different people are dealing with it. And part of it is philosophical, of understanding of how do we think we would like to help our students understand these different huge parts of their life. So I do think if we can address these very, very complicated issues, it would be really giving a gift to the students. So, I'm curious sort of where you were coming from in terms of what prompted you to ask the question of, do the subjects need to agree? Was there something in particular you were thinking of, or is a certain experience that you've had with students, or?
No, I was thinking first, religion is something that, I don't know, it's hard to be scientific in general, not theology, but religion as itself, because how do you want to prove God, or what? These kind of questions, also what religion brings in general. And that's why the first was a more personal question. The second one was, if they, for example, reject science in general, like evolution, does it also, affect are they also in school, in other classes, are they also are there good students also in biology, or do they totally reject it and doesn't even learn the input of it? This was my main goal of the question. But also when you talk about it, I also recognize that I knew some ultra-Orthodox from the Jewish community that they in interreligious dialogue. They were not ultra. They were just Orthodox, I think. But for example, they refused also to go to a church. Does it all? I mean, how is it? How is life then? I mean, living together when you're rejecting your counterpart. I
Yeah.
mean, isn't it hard?
And I think one of the questions sort of relates to something that we had been speaking about of a potential positive result. If you perhaps grew up your whole life thinking that Judaism or Islam or any religion had to be against evolution, and then you're brought sources that show that leading rabbis or Muslim leaders have said that there is not a conflict. So then it shows you that something that you always assumed, you always thought was not necessarily true. And perhaps that insight might make you think, oh, wow, maybe there is much more to learn out there in the world, and things that I didn't think were true on other subjects, you know, might make me more open there as well. So again, I think there's always the balance and the juggling act of science and secularity being sometimes a worldview that people feel is very much coming out to homogenize them, of saying, you know, your particular identity is not so special. Come and be like all of us in the world. Well, we're all just
Yes.
one. And of course, we're all so similar. But of course, there is also this great challenge of we want to preserve our unique traditions in addition to reaching out and loving between communities. So I agree that you're putting your finger on, you know, one of the bigger challenges of the day. And the question is, what is the place of science in this? What can it be? What should it be? And I think sometimes it's really interesting showing the students historically different cases. I know, for example, there was a book recently written on responses to Copernicus. And, you know, that's such an old controversy that we always assume, you know, that one must have been easy for religious people to accept. But, you know, it was a long process there as well of people from all different religious traditions trying to understand this entirely new understanding of the universe and what it could mean religiously. So perhaps we can take some comfort in our current challenges to understand that this is a long process and it's an interesting process, and we should, you know, take part as opposed to being thrown by it. But thank you for your questions. I think they're very, very on target.
Thank you for the answers.
Thank you. We have two more comments in the chat. That's another important aspect: terrorizing teachers who go against extremist ideas held by students and go and complain.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the questions of how do the teachers get the motivations to do something which is perhaps not required by the curriculum, and perhaps could draw heat from parents and students. It's no question that's the big challenge in this one. Absolutely.
And the other comment is from our dear colleague from Indonesia, Lutfi Rahman, writes, one of the issues we are dealing with in Indonesian context as the majority Muslim country is that those students who really deny the issue of evolution will most likely tend to be very extreme and close to be critical. Most of them will claim they are the most Islamic. On the other hand, those who accept it tend to be more secular or even will be atheist. I would agree that the portion of imparting science and religion to students has to be moderately taken into account and paid more attention to.
Yes, I agree very much that is the dilemma, because what you're saying is the reality somehow seems to reinforce this understanding that once you accept evolution, it's like pulling that string in the pillowcase, the whole thing can unravel. And I think that is definitely a fear that people have, that it seems if you want to be authentic in the traditional sense that you should go with a strictly religious understanding of the origins. But again, what we found in the study is once you really speak to the experts, when we were speaking to the religious experts here, we were not picking people, obviously in the religious stream, we were not picking atheists, we were picking people who were very, very religious and very committed, and they all felt it was actually quite important to speak about the lack of contradiction. So I'm curious also in the Indonesian context, I know I've seen some research on Indonesian teachers and the teaching of evolution, but I think in all of the communities, it certainly is very helpful when there are those leading role models of religious experts who are speaking about it in a different way, who show that there are authentic traditional religious responses, not just in the rejectionist sense. And I don't think I answered your question fully. Certainly when people feel that they reject evolution, there are some people who definitely will take it in a more extremist sense. And then there are some people who will reject evolution while saying that the rest of science can be accepted. So that's also an interesting thing to explore further. But one of the things that certainly in America, when they were trying to promote evolution education that's open to religion, more so than religious education that's open to evolution, where we're trying to look at both sides. But one of the things they feel is the most helpful is to have those role models. So if you don't have the religious role model of a leader who is very, very religious, very traditional, and also accepting of evolution, then it's hard to move forward. I couldn't agree more. So perhaps those are resources that each tradition mines for themselves and comes up with particular people that can be pointed to in terms of sources, in terms of lectures. Again, YouTube is not only on YouTube, it's not only a rejectionist and extremist positions. Perhaps there can be other positions uploaded that give alternative perspectives. I know it's not easy in every context. I know it can be very charged and loaded, but I agree with you that it's hard for the discussion to progress without those leaders to be able to be resources. So
I think also, Rachel, it is important to make it to mention also the difference between accept, believe, and understand when we're talking about evolution and science and belief.
do you want to explain that a bit?
I am sure you can do it better than me. I'm giving it to you.
What Nijmi is referring to is Professor Adnan Aslan's friend Hanan Alexander. He has the idea how in religious education, we have understandings that we can be within our own tradition, but learn from and about other traditions. And his question, one of his questions in this project is, could the same be true about science? For example, someone coming from a more traditional religious perspective that would tend to reject evolution, could they still learn about evolution? Could they still really try to understand the science fully, even if they're not sure whether they accept it or not? And that's somewhat perhaps of an in-between perspective that is still being explored. Is that what you were referring to? I mean, there's always the question of, as we've been discussing up until now, if you are presented, if you think that this is against your religion, then it's hard to be open enough to learn, even for understanding, even if not for acceptance. So it's always a tension that we're exploring.
Thank you very much. I think we don't have any more questions. And we are quite good in time. So thanks again, Dr. Per, for the very exciting lecture. I really learned a lot today, and I'm convinced that our listeners feel the same way. Many thanks also to you, dear listeners, for your important questions and the contributions to the discussion. Yes, this concludes our session for today. The next lecture in the series will take place on, I think, 17th of January. It will be a German lecture by Professor Dr. Matthias Beck on the relationship of Christianity to natural science and medicine. Hopefully we can welcome you to our next lectures. And thanks again. I wish you a good evening. Best regards from Vienna, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you to all of you for the warm welcome and the great questions, and looking forward to staying in touch. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.